Dennis Metzler, and welcome to The Charge. Today we have with us Dr. Matthew Lundberg, who is the director of the DeVries Institute for Global Faculty Development at Calvin University, and the author of Christian Martyrdom and Christian Violence on Suffering and Wielding the Sword, published by Oxford University Press in 2021. Dr. Lundberg, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Dennis. I'm glad to be here talking with you.
All right, so we're going to be dealing with the issue of just war and pacifism and martyrdom. I've already put out 3 videos promoting pacifism, and I already have a couple scholars lined up who are going to promote pacifism. And I thought it only fair to bring on somebody from just war opinion, and it's good for me, and it challenges me, and so this will be good. First of all, in your book relating to martyrdom, just war, and pacifism, what was your purpose? What were you hoping to accomplish in the book?
Well, first of all, I should say it's very kind of you to, have someone else representing the other perspective on this Christian conversation. This project started out as more general research on the theological meaning of martyrdom. And in the course of doing that research, I kind of got fascinated with the question of how to make sense of this paradox that we encounter from time to time when we look at the mainstream Christian church and its history. And this is the paradox that the book is all about. On the one hand, we see that suffering violence for Jesus' sake, suffering violence out of faithfulness for him, with the martyrs as sort of the key example and symbol of that, is set right next to the Christian church's willingness to sanction the inflicting of violence in certain circumstances, with just war being the main example of that. We've got the suffering of violence, the highest echelon of the saints, the martyrs, and we've got the inflicting of violence through Christian soldiers. So the book is trying to make sense of that paradox. Is it a paradox that we can make sense of, or is it more of a contradiction, the way that some in the pacifist camp might think? As you already indicated with your introduction, I think that there is a way to make sense of it, but I guess we'll continue talking about that.
All right. And so how do you define martyrdom? And could you talk about its origins? And particularly, you distinguish between martyrdom of confession and martyrdom of passion and action.
Yeah, so martyrdom in general, I would define as a death that offers a witness to Christ. A death that somehow offers a witness to the meaning of Jesus Christ and the life of following him. As you know from reading the book, the Greek language from the New Testament of martus is language taken from the courtroom of the ancient world. It has to do with witness and testimony. So the New Testament talks about martus, martyria, as witness to Jesus, the witness to Jesus that Christians make through the way they live their lives. But then there are also indications in the New Testament that a life lived for Jesus also can extend to the way that one dies for Jesus. We see that especially in the book of Revelation. But the early church confronted a lot of persecution. There were times when Christians were they faced a lot of hostility simply for the fact that they were Christian, and therefore they refused to do certain things that were asked of them or required of them in the Roman context. So this language of witness and testimony from the New Testament, really focused on life, gets applied more and more to a death for Christ in the early church. It becomes kind of a technical term of sorts, someone who dies for their confession of Christ. And in more recent decades, the Christian church has become more aware of the fact that there are other ways in which Christians are brought by their faith to an untimely death. It's not just for being Christian. We could think of those as martyrs of confession, but also sometimes the actions that a Christian chooses to take can bring them to an untimely death. So I sometimes, in the book, I talk about martyrs of Christian action. So martyrs of Christian confession and martyrs of Christian action. With someone like Oscar Romero, the Salvadoran archbishop, as one example. He takes on some of the powers of repression and death in his society and is assassinated for it. Or someone like Maximilian Kolbe in Auschwitz, the Polish Franciscan priest, who volunteers to die in the place of another prisoner. So they're doing certain things out of faithfulness to Christ that end up leading to their deaths. So I think those are just different forms of witness to the way of Jesus Christ, which is why we are inclined to use the language of martyrdom to talk about them.
All right. And throughout the book, you keep coming back to 6 criteria for martyrdom. So what all is involved there? What are the essential points of that?
Yeah, one of the things I noticed, Dennis, when I started doing research on martyrdom is I started to hear the language in places other than theology. I remember reading an article, this was years and years ago, talking about how, Lance Armstrong, when he got, caught for using performance-enhancing drugs, was sort of portraying himself as a martyr. Or we'll sometimes talk about someone who has a martyr complex because of the way that they kind of relish the sense that they're being mistreated. And then there's the fact that, other religious traditions other than Christianity also can use the language of martyrdom. So I became more convinced that to make theological use, careful theological use of the notion of martyrdom requires us to be pretty clear on what its main meaning is in Christianity. And so in the book, I tried to develop some markers or criteria of martyrdom. And as you mentioned, there are 6 of them. I mean, I'm not necessarily, wedded to the idea of there being 6, but these were just 6 that struck me as important, that I kept coming back to. And I don't know that your viewers here necessarily want to hear about all 6 of them, but the gist of them is that a Christian martyr, notice I say Christian martyr, is someone who dies for something integral to Christian faith. There's also what a former student of mine called the opt-out clause. A Christian martyr is someone who could have opted out of death by doing what the Romans wanted you to do, or by not persecuting the Salvadoran, forces of death as vociferously, but they didn't opt out. And also other things like how self-renunciation, a sense of facing God, in heading towards death, those are also some of the markers or criteria of martyrdom that I think help us to have some guardrails on when we're talking about Christian martyrdom as opposed to certain other conceptions. Does that make sense?
Sure. All righty. And let's go ahead and move on to pacifism. So you've got a fair amount of time spent on defining it and its biblical basis. Could you say more about that?
Yeah. One of the things that I hope in this book, and therefore in this conversation, is that people like you, who identify as Christian pacifists, will be able to recognize themselves in the descriptions that someone like me makes of pacifism, even though I land on a different position, as a Christian. So I'll be curious to hear from you in a minute whether you think that I've missed something, or whether there's more to it that I'm not quite touching on. But I guess in pretty simple terms, I see Christian pacifism as the view that the Christian is called to a life of nonviolence or a life of peaceableness. And that's clearly not passive in the sense of passivity, just allowing yourself to be acted upon. It's a life of action towards peace, rather than resorting to violence. So I think the core of Christian pacifism would be that in the Christian life, there is no sanction for violence in the life of the Christian. So if we were to talk about what the main biblical argument is for it, I think we could say it's Jesus' teaching primarily, and also his example. In particular, the Sermon on the Mount, That's something I keep coming back to in the book because I really do see that as the heartbeat of Christian pacifism. You turn the other cheek, do good to those who persecute you, love your enemy. And there are lots of things that we could add, but I think that's really at the core of it. The Christian pacifist senses that they're called to follow Jesus in that regard, to take those, what I call in the book, harder lines of the Sermon on the Mount quite directly and straightforwardly. And we'll probably talk about this as we go, but if that's the core biblical argument for pacifism, it also could be kind of the soft spot for the just war perspective. That's why I think the just war perspective needs to take that on. But before we talk more about that, I'm kind of curious, what's your reaction to my description of pacifism?
Well, yeah, I certainly agree with all that. And violence has to be defined. Is it just lethal violence that pacifists are opposed to? Or are there any points where we use non-lethal force? And I would say yes. But also, I think the notion of Christ as Messiah, as King, totally turns on its head worldly notions of what it means to be a king, what it means to be a sovereign of a people. He comes as a king to die, which is highly unusual. The king is the most protected person in the kingdom, and he really gives himself up to a torturous death and asks his followers, take up your cross like me, be willing to die like me. So that figures in strongly also for me. But we'll get into more details about the strengths and weaknesses of pacifism and all that.
Yeah. Great.
So you take some time then with talking about how pacifism was understood and practiced, both in the early church and with Anabaptists. Could you go into some detail about that?
With both of those movements, the early church and the Anabaptist movement in the time of the Reformation, early 17th century, we're talking about Christians that find themselves as minority groups in situations where there's a lot of hostility directed toward them by the powers that be, whether it's the Romans or the official governments of places like what we would call Germany today, or England, or wherever in Europe of the 16th century. So perhaps one of the things that feeds the pacifism of those points in history is the fact that resistance was kind of futile. Think of the power of the Roman Empire in contrast to the rather small, powerless nature of the early Christian movement. But to focus just on, resistance being futile could give you the impression that the pacifism of those groups was more a matter of having few other options, when I actually think it was more principled. And I think many of the Christians in those situations would hear what you just said a couple of minutes ago about how the kingship of Christ turns the ways of the world on their head, and they would agree with that. I think really the main feeder of pacifism, Christian pacifism in those times, the more principled reasons, is their sense that the Christian life should look significantly different than the ways of the world around them. The Sermon on the Mount, but also the example of Jesus, or kind of a sense of the way of Christ, is what's feeding that.
All right. And can you give some specific examples then of, say, what the early fathers taught on the subject?
Sure. The early fathers are kind of interesting in the sense that most of them are probably what we would describe as pacifist, although there's some debate in the scholarly community about the reasons why. One of the clear reasons why is that they sensed that being part of the Roman military required religious practices that they took to be idolatrous, whether that's sacrificing to the emperor or other symbols of Roman religious allegiance. The earliest Christians were not comfortable with that because they thought that it was idolatry. It was to give honor to to give religious honor to beings other than the one true creator God. So they said no. So in a lot of the early Christian fathers, what you have is reflections on how the things that soldiers were called to do were just not permissible for the Christians. And oftentimes they're talking about more what we would think of today as more religious things. And at least in my reading of some of the sources, I don't see as many mentions of violence there as we might expect. But at the same time, so I would say it's the religious obligations of Roman military life that they're first and foremost opposed to. But then there are also times when they will mention things like, how the use of the sword is something that Christ commanded his followers not to participate in. Or sometimes either quotations of or allusions to the Sermon on the Mount. But, I think there's a lot of things going on there in the trend in the early church towards what we would describe today as a pacifist approach to the ethics of violence.
Right. And you also have the interpretation of Psalms or any other passages in the Old Testament having to do with warfare were always spiritualized by the fathers. But then after Constantine, it's like, no, we're taking these literally.
Yeah.
It's also interesting that Lactantius gave the most explicit prohibition of violence and warfare of any writer that I've seen. However, after Constantine, he totally changed his tune. It's like now that the emperor and the empire is on our side, he gave a just war interpretation. So there's some fascinating stuff going on there.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And at moments where we emphasize the abruptness of that shift, it probably should lead Christians to scratch our heads a little bit and to wonder whether a significantly wrong turn was made at that moment in history. I think there are some other examples that we could talk about where, there had been this question about social responsibility that had been weighing upon Christians for a long time, for the first couple of centuries. And perhaps because they had been wrestling with that and had encountered Roman soldiers who converted to Christ but remained soldiers, there are other folks around the time of Constantine that take that shift more in stride. It's more of a shift than an about face. That is one of those things that historians and to some extent theologians have been arguing about for a long time, is what to make sense of this shift in the early church from Christianity as this persecuted movement where many public figures would best be described as pacifist in their approach, to one where Christianity, the cross gets put on the shields and the emblems of the Roman army, pretty quickly. So, I think that's something that even as someone in the just war camp, I'm willing to acknowledge that there's some stuff there we really need to ponder if we're being honest.
Could be a problem there, right?
Yeah.
All right. And what was it, can you say more about what distinguished the Anabaptists from the magisterial reformers? It wasn't just pacifism, but what did it grow out of?
Yeah, I would say the pacifism was connected to something a bit broader, the sense that the Christian community needed to live according to its own way of doing things. So there was this sense of separation or distinctiveness required for the Christian community in contrast to the ways of the state or the ways of the broader society. So I guess we could call that a form of separatism. And that was also related to something else that we see written into the very label Anabaptist. This opposition to infant baptism, in part because infant baptism was seen to lead to kind of nominal Christianity. People are baptized when they're born, when they're babies, before they know anything about it, and that leads to this sort of, not all that ardent form of living the Christian life. That's probably not the most delicate way that one could say that, but I think you see the point that I'm getting at. So the sense that being a Christian is something that's heavier, requires someone's choice, requires the will of the person to opt into the life of following Jesus and all the risks and costs associated with it, including, sadly, in the case of many Anabaptists in the 16th and 17th century, martyrdom. So once again, there's a lot of things going on there.
Right. And at the time, too, being baptized was also apparently synonymous with becoming a citizen. So it was tied to nationalism and making yourself available to whatever the state dictated.
Yeah, so Christendom, in the time, to be a Christian was basically to be a citizen, and to be a citizen was to be a Christian. And that could lead to problematic forms of both of those identities. And the Anabaptists, I think, kind of saw something problematic there that they wanted to avoid. And that fed, that was one of the things that fed their approach to baptism. The other one, I think, was just that they read the New Testament and they thought that there was better evidence for what we would today call believers' baptism rather than infant baptism.
All right, then. And you also tie in your 6 criteria of martyrdom to pacifism. So what is key there for us to understand?
Yeah. So at the end of chapter 2, which talks about Anabaptist martyrologies and kind of the pacifist argument, I return to the criteria of martyrdom, basically to say that if pacifism is true, if that's the way of life that the New Testament, or the Bible as a whole, but the New Testament in particular, if that's the life that Christ calls us to, then we would need to be a little more specific in some of the criteria of martyrdom. We would need to add that distinctiveness of faith that the Christian martyr dies for includes nonviolence. It includes a refusal to give in to the world's coercive, lethal ways of being. Now, in the end, I don't add that to the criteria of martyrdom that I end up with at the end of the book, for reasons that the book explains. But I do think there's an important lesson that even just war Christians can draw from that there really does need to be something distinctive, something genuinely self-renouncing, self-denying about the Christian way of life in order for that way of life, when it leads to premature death, to be labeled martyrdom.
And how would you sum up the strengths and weaknesses of Christian pacifism?
Yeah, the strengths and weaknesses. I think on the strength side, there's a straightforwardness there in relation to certain aspects of the New Testament. There's the teaching of Jesus, in particular, the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 in particular. There are some of the things that you mentioned earlier about this sense that if we look at the way of life of Jesus, the way he lived for the kingdom, we see that there's the power dynamics of the world are turned on their head. So I think there's something intuitively persuasive about Christian pacifism's call for believers to live in a radically different way than the world. The way of the world so often relies on power, on threat, on coercion, and on force. With Jesus, we see something different going on. Christian pacifism, at its best, tries to follow suit. In terms of weaknesses, because that was part of your question too, you're not just looking for strengths, since that's the view you're inclined towards, right?
Yes.
I mean, I think there are situations that we can think of in life where the call to nonviolence seems hard or even unrealistic. You might think of a situation where a family member or a loved one that we are responsible for is threatened in a dire way, and we have the power to do something, even if it involves harming the person who's trying to victimize them. I think there's something almost instinctive in us that suggests that using violence in a case like that is different than using violence simply with the aim of harming someone or getting something for yourself.
And you call that secondary violence, right?
Yeah, I distinguish between first order violence, which is sort of aggression, takes lots of forms, Russia, assault. And then second order violence is responsive violence, which at its best is a violence that is intended to defend or repair rather than to harm. So speaking of situations where pacifism doesn't seem to work, that's putting it really crassly, but at least it gets the point across. I think what's been going on in Ukraine for the past 100+ days is an example of kind of the sensibility that many non-pacifists would point to as part of their reasoning, part of the reasoning that takes them more in a just war direction. But I think biblically, there's the fact that there are points in the Christian canon where God appears to use violence for good ends. That the fact that Jesus doesn't tell soldier converts to him to change their jobs. And then in a really broad sense as a principle, there's this command to protect the widow and the orphan. And I don't take that literally meaning just the widow and just the orphan, but a sense of protecting the vulnerable. I think that's one of the other things that flows into the just war mentality, that there are times when aggression is so egregious that the only way to protect the vulnerable is by means of the sword.
Right. And I would totally agree. That's what I would always consider the essential weakness of pacifism. Certainly pacifistic, nonviolent resistance has been very effective in certain historical situations. And however, there's others, Hitler's Germany or Stalin's Russia, or the Soviet Union, who are probably not at all. It's interesting to me, though, and I'd like to hear your reflection on this, that along with that, the strongest objection we hear about the very existence of God is that it's impossible for God to be both all-powerful and all good, because otherwise how can you account for the evil in the world? So if we say God does exist and God does allow all this evil, so I'd say likewise, to me, that points to the truth of pacifism. It's more in the character of God, is that sometimes is that we can't prevent that evil.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach that I haven't quite thought about in those terms. I think there's a certain distance of what you're saying where the just war advocate would agree. Well, I guess we'll probably talk about this next when we get into the logic of just war thinking, but the just war approach does not say that the just person can do whatever it takes to stop evil or to stop first order violence from happening. There are limits, there are restraints, things like that. I guess it's more a difference of opinion over the point at which we have to acknowledge that there are times when we have to leave certain things to God and realize that our own powers are not up to the task.
All right. So let's go ahead and define just war, and what is your scriptural basis for it?
Yeah, defining the just war, sometimes scholars will say that in a more technical sense, we should talk about it as justified war. War, not so much that is justice or is just in a really full sense, but war that is justified as a response to very serious aggression. But in a broad sense, it would be choosing to wage war and then waging war in ways that are consistent with justice. And from reading through the book and probably from your study of the ethics of war, that the just war tradition is sometimes broken down into two main sets of considerations. First of all, considerations regarding to the decision to go to war or not. And then secondly, decisions about how to fight, with what spirit and with what weapons to fight.
And what are the terms for those two?
Yeah, I mean, over the last 100 or so years, there have been some Latin terms that crop up occasionally. There's the justus ad bellum, the question of going to war, and then there's the justus in bello while you're fighting. So on the
Yeah.
ad bellum side, I mean, I thought you were going to want me to avoid some of the Latin terms.
Oh, no. Bring in the foreign language for sure.
Yeah, some of my students don't always think that way. But on the ad bellum side, there are considerations like just cause. That there is a serious aggression that needs to be responded to. Otherwise, the possibility of order, justice, and flourishing in society will, either be destroyed or threatened. There's right intention, that war, if you're going to go to war, that needs to be with the aim of reestablishing a just peace, not, gaining more territory for yourself or your country or other forms of gain. So things like that, I don't know that we need to talk about all of the considerations that typically fall under that ad bellum category. But another one of them that's important enough that it definitely needs to be mentioned is that it's the responsibility of the sovereign of a nation to make that decision. And that could look different under different polities. Under democratic regimes, it might look a little different than a totalitarian, authoritarian regime, but that it's the responsibility of the sovereign to discern whether there is a just cause, serious just cause, and then also to, if deciding to go to war, make sure that the intention is right in doing so.
But the thing that gets the most press is probably related to civilian casualties.
And that takes us to the in bello side of things. So it would be very possible for a country to go to war legitimately, responding to an act of injustice, an act of aggression, but then to be totally indiscriminate in the way they fight. The just war tradition would declare that to be wrong. And one of the key considerations of the in bello side of things is non-combatant immunity, which includes civilians, but it also includes prisoners of war, but also things at more of a attitudinal level, like right intention. The soldier, both those who are commanding the fighting and those who are actually doing the fighting, are called not to fight with hate or vengefulness in their hearts and their kind of their spirit of fighting, but in a way that perhaps strangely even respects the enemy, because enemy soldiers also bear the image of God and are loved by Jesus Christ. So, it's the ad bellum and the in bello. That's the main way that the tradition breaks down as we analyze it. Dennis, you also asked, the second part of your question was probably the hardest of all, the scriptural basis for it. I would say that it's probably more of the basis for it is probably more philosophical and theological than directly biblical. It's more the discernment that life in the world is a good thing that is worth protecting. Aggression threatens it. And then there might be passages of scripture like the widows and orphans passage or recurring command that I talked about a few minutes ago that we could bring in, or the fact that Jesus doesn't command soldiers to turn over their weapons when they, turn their hearts to him.
It is interesting, though, that the soldiers he's referring to are occupying soldiers.
Yeah.
They are the enemy.
Yeah, that's true. I guess I just think, and this is not an original thought of mine. I mean, there are a number of scholars who point this out, but you would think that if pacifism was one of those sort of absolute requirements of the life of discipleship, that we would get a bit more of a sense of that in the way that Jesus interacts with soldiers. I mean, it's kind of it wouldn't be an argument that would ever work by itself. It's one of those sort of supporting lines of argument from Scripture.
Right. And if pacifists are honest, we will admit to being frustrated over that.
Yeah. Honesty, it's always good.
It seems to me, as a pacifist, a strong argument, too, is that clearly in the Old Testament, God used warfare. And yet with the New Testament, we don't really see a really clear expressed renunciation of that. The love your enemy and all that sort of thing can be relativized, but if if it's not clearly revoked like other things in the Old Testament are, then we can assume it's to be maintained. So I think there's an argument there. I mean, I don't think it's ultimately convincing, of course, but I think there is something there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, and very honest of you even to bring that up to help me try to articulate my own argument. I mean, I think one of the dangers, it's clearly not something that you're lapsing into, but one of the dangers is that we end up pitting the God of the Old Testament against the God of the New Testament as revealed by Jesus. That the one is, the Old Testament God uses war and vengefulness and all of that, right. But then Jesus is all about forgiveness, love, right. Mercy. That's a little too neat and tidy.
Well, Marcion made that mistake, and a lot of Christians tend to fall into that error still.
Yeah. So I think you're an example of someone articulating a pacifist point of view that's clearly aware of that problem and trying to avoid that. And I think then the just war approach is leaning into continuity just in the other direction.
Right. All right. So let's dig into the logic of just war. You spent a lot of time on that, talking about reality of sin, Christian love, nature and varieties of violence, and the life and ethics of Jesus.
Yeah, I think the core, well, is there a core? Sin, well, one of the fruits of sin is aggression in God's good world. Aggression that seriously threatens the well-being of people, of vulnerable people in the world. That's the kind of violence that we've already talked about as first-order violence. So I think the just war approach is kind of energized in part by this sense that if aggression is left unchecked, it will lead to extremely bad consequences for the world that God created and the world that God loves. But love comes into the picture as one of the motivating factors for a person to fight, using second-order violence to defend society, to defend the possibility of everyday life, of having children, of children going to school, of people growing old. Love isn't, in part at least, what motivates the decision to fight, to preserve potential victims or actual victims from the tyranny that is brought by aggression. But in the just war tradition, love is also the motivating factor for restraining fighting, for attempting to fight in ways that are consistent with justice in a broad sense. Rather than it just being a kind of no holds barred total war that will just take down anything in its way. So love even for the enemy. So that's one of the ways that the just war tradition tries to bring in Jesus' call to love our enemy. Maybe a kind of a weird way, or at least a way that I think would. I'm someone who's never fought. I've never served as a law enforcement officer. I've never served as a soldier. I've been an academic most of my life. So it's easy for me to talk about this while also recognizing that there's a bit of a gap between what I'm talking about and what it must be like to actually experience this sort of thing. But to fight against someone who either is an aggressor or is a tool of aggression in a way that nevertheless loves him or her as the enemy that Christ calls us to love. I mean, I think that's probably one of the trickiest aspects of what we sometimes talk about is the spirituality of the just war from a Christian standpoint.
All right. So, and can you say more about varieties of violence, really how you define it? And because, of course, there's whether it's lethal or non-lethal, it can make a huge difference.
Yeah, I guess I think you're right. Lethal violence is of a sort of different order.
We're talking about violence, secondary violence here to prevent aggressive violence.
Yeah, so there's aggressive violence, there's first order violence, the kind of violence that antagonizes, that intends to harm, or is used for the purpose of enriching a group or enlarging their territory. I mean, I think it's pretty clear, especially from a Christian standpoint, that that's the kind of violence that is condemned by Scripture, by theological teaching. So when we're arguing about whether violence is ever permissible for the Christian, we're talking about whether second-order violence, that responsive violence, at its best, reparative violence, is ever justified. Now, second-order violence can sometimes take the form of this hopeless cry of despair. Folks lashing out because there's really little else to do given what faces them in life. The just war tradition would say that's perhaps understandable, but it's more of an expression of vengefulness than of an attempt towards repair. So it's really that form of second order violence that is intended to restore just peace. That's the sort of violence that the just war tradition believes can be justified. There might be times when it's not justified, but there are times when it is justified. So I mean, we have to be very careful that just war tradition does not give its blessing to violence in all of its many, many forms. And it's also, I think, at its best, pretty attuned to the problems of violence, including the problems of second order violence, that they can spiral into, what could start out as well-intentioned, justified violence can easily kind of creep towards expressions of vengefulness, or can end up harming the civilian, the non-combatant. So I think at its best, the just war tradition is pretty sober-minded about violence.
All right, and I really appreciate that you put a lot of emphasis on that the just war tradition is not about just justifying violence, but it's about restraining it. So it seems to me that if I was going to defend just war as a Christian, as a Spirit-filled believer, there are situations, say you're in enemy territory. You're not just trying to kill everybody you can. You're not even necessarily trying to kill every soldier you can. Maybe some of those soldiers are ready to surrender. Maybe some of those soldiers on the other side really don't want to do what they're doing. So how do we know? It would come from the Spirit. It would have to be the Spirit leading us to kill the person that God is calling us to kill, and it would have to be Spirit empowered. This is not on our strength, but this is an act of God working through us. And so, to me, unless we're willing to use that sort of language, Spirit-directed killing, Spirit-empowered killing, then I don't see how it can be theologically justified. Any thoughts?
Yeah, that's a good point. And you're really putting your finger on one of the tensions of the just war tradition. My initial instinct to what you were saying is to shy away a little bit, to shy away from that language of Spirit-led or Spirit-empowered killing. And I'll get back to why in just a second. Yeah, you can probably already tell why. I definitely think you're right when you're talking about how it would be the nudges of the Spirit, or sort of the Spirit-led life of discipline in Christian faith as a disciple that would be absolutely required for the Christian soldier to bring that restraint and discernment onto the battlefield, especially given just the pressures and the frenzy of the battlefield. There has to be that grace and action of the Spirit in order to help the person who could quite understandably get carried away with the emotions and the pain and the fervor of the battlefield.
And also what his compatriots are doing that have no restraint.
Yeah, so there's examples of this in war memoirs, but also novels and film of the difficulty of, say, one soldier having to stand up to another soldier on the same side to say, no, we can't do that, or no, you shouldn't do that, or no, I won't do that. Or to command, to command if you're an officer, to command your men to exercise that restraint in the way they are carrying out their mission. But cycling back to the spirit-empowered killing, I guess one of the reasons why I might shy away from that a little bit is just because, oh boy, there's just something strange about using that language. And even though I'm defending the just war tradition, I think there's something about the intuitive strangeness of that should lead me to scratch my head a little bit. But also I think because Christians can make, well, warriors, but even Christian warriors can also make mistakes. There are times when we might think that we are being led by the Spirit, but it can also be our own sinfulness that deludes us into thinking that. So I guess I have an easier time, and maybe this is just too much of an easy out, I have an easier time acknowledging the Spirit's role in enabling the Christian soldier to do good even on the battlefield than on this. And I want to shy away from the possibility of ascribing to the Spirit possible misdeeds on the part of Christians. But I think we're always doing that kind of juggling act in theology, even beyond questions of fighting, because that's one of the ways that we deal with the problem of evil, is by saying that the source of all good in the world is God. It's not us primarily doing it, but the source of evil in the world is ultimately human freedom misdirected. So you see why I'm shying away from that?
Isn't part of it, though, according to a certain reading of Romans 13, it's not about the Spirit leading or empowering us. It's about God, who has established the authorities to govern and to use the sword, whether it's in police action or in warfare. So it's God through them, and our killing in that context is under that heading. So it's not really our responsibility in a sense, because God has empowered and established the governing authorities. So it's not on us. Maybe it's on our commanding officers, but it's really on the king.
Yeah, I think there's something right about that. That can also be too much of an easy out, that it's God who has ordained this office of the sword. So what we do if I'm a police officer or a soldier, what I do is the responsibility of the state, or it's the responsibility of God who ordained the state. I do think at the level of decisions and actions, we're responsible. We expect warriors, we expect police officers to follow the rules of engagement. And we think that there are times when they ought to be held accountable when they don't. So I do think there's a place for agency there that prevents us from simply throwing up our hands and saying, well, it's not really my responsibility.
We can't just say, I was just following orders.
Yeah.
The world doesn't accept that.
Yeah.
All right. Could you look at several thinkers throughout the just war tradition that you see as defending that? Could you spend a little time with Augustine, Bonhoeffer, and Neibuhr?
Sure. I mean, with Augustine, one of the things that we get from him is some early just war reflections that the Christian church has drawn upon in developing its moral reflection on this particular problem of aggression and how to respond to it. In a broader sense, Augustine gives us this vision of two cities, of the city of God, the way that the world was meant to be and the way that it will be, in contrast to the world under the power of sin, the earthly city versus the heavenly city. And Augustine is quite powerful in the way he explains the dynamics of the world of history as a kind of overlap of those two cities. We live in that overlap where we see sin and aggression around us, and we even sense sin and aggression in our own lives and our own hearts. But the Christian church, through Christ's grace, through the power of the Spirit, is able to witness to the city of God through the way that we live in that overlap. And, for someone like Augustine, that includes the acknowledgement that we may at times need to testify to the good of the city of God by means of tools that are part of the city of the world. That's in part what's going on with a just war. You're using certain tools that are not going to be part of ultimate heavenly existence in the quest for better justice, not perfect justice, better order, not perfect order in the world that we inhabit right now. So I think there's a sense in which Augustine provides, in a way, a kind of worldview within which just war reasoning can make some sense.
So with Augustine, though, it seems strange that just war people would use him. I mean, because he goes so far as to defend just war or even torture in regard to heresy, in regard to keeping heresy under wraps.
Yeah, so I think we'd have to be careful to just take what Augustine says and plop it right down in our contemporary context. He's an early articulator of some just war principles. And as you just pointed out, we have to be a little careful about labeling that just war in the same sense that we tend to think about it today, because you're right. Many of his reflections have to do with the threat, or what he perceived as the threat, of certain heretical movements in the society of his day. So, I mean, that gets a little closer to the category of holy war. But at the same time, he gives us some early reflections on some of the criteria or the considerations, as I said earlier, of just fighting the way they are understood later on in the tradition.
Okay, so how about Bonhoeffer and then Neibuhr?
Let me talk about Neibuhr first, and then Bonhoeffer. I think with Neibuhr, there's a powerful sense of sin. Sin as what leads to aggression and needs to be restrained, but also this powerful sense that even the just warrior, if you don't mind me using that term just for convenience, even the just warrior is a sinner. So with Neibuhr, there are these powerful warnings against seeing even the just war as this battle of good, clear, pure good against evil. For someone like Neibuhr, the restraint that's required for fighting appropriately is in part funded by this sense that even my own side is sinful. Even I am sinful, and therefore I need to see myself fighting against fellow sinners. So there's a kind of a restraining function there. With Bonhoeffer, mainly what I draw from Bonhoeffer is his sense of the murkiness of the world that we live in. He uses the language, and I refer to it a number of times in the book, of the moral twilight. That when we're presented with the challenges of the world, the hard decisions of life in the world, and of course he has in mind his own role in the resistance movement in Germany, his own question about what to do about Hitler. I don't want to get directly into that, but for him, that comes out in the form of talking about how clear-cut principles or guidelines only get us so far in the moral life. Ultimately, the Christian has to venture a choice in discipleship, while also throwing ourselves upon the mercy of Christ. So for someone like Bonhoeffer, and I think he might go a little too far in this, he might give the impression that principles really don't have a place in the moral reasoning of our lives, but he at least quite eloquently gives language for us to acknowledge the hard choices, the difficult decisions, the fact that things are often not clear-cut. All of those things, I think, are just part of our lives, definitely part of our social world. So what do we do about Russia's aggression in a situation where Ukrainians are suffering egregiously, but yet there's this threat of nuclear weapons, that that makes it unclear. I mean, oftentimes in the past, you might think, well, there's this naked act of aggression, so the just war thing to do would be to go in and defend. But if that could spiral into this broader conflict that could have even worse devastating consequences for the world, that becomes a harder call to make. So Bonhoeffer's language of twilight, and then I sometimes like putting it in terms of tragedy, or the tragic dimension of Christian existence in the world, where it's not just an obvious good that we go out and do, but more of a partial good that we're striving for in ways, in ways that reflect our own sinfulness, but also just reflect the limitations of knowledge, of possibilities, of all of those sorts of things in the world.
All right, then, and how would you describe, to sum up, the strengths and weaknesses of just war?
Well, strengths and weaknesses. I think the way that the strengths game works with just war is that we sometimes point to situations where it seems like the obvious thing to do is to intervene. If, let's say, one of my kids was still young and being threatened by someone else, I would sense this obligation to intervene on behalf of them, even if it required me to do violence to someone who was trying to harm them. And at that point, I don't know that the lethal versus non-lethal violence distinction is going to get us that far. Maybe it would. I mean, but even in just war thinking, less serious violence is to be preferred over the more serious violence. Or, what do you do about Hitler in the late 1930s and early 1940s? What do you do about, aggression that is unleashed into the world, harming people? We certainly shouldn't just let it happen. We have to do something. I think that instinct is one of the main strengths of the just war tradition. I also think that it's serious in its awareness of the spiraling of violence, the need for second order violence to have some checks and balances on it, some restraint on it, lest it just spiral into new forms of aggression that just take the world in a more abysmal direction. So, those would be a few of the strengths that would come to my mind. In terms of weaknesses, I think it has a slightly harder time with the Sermon on the Mount, as we've already talked about. So in a way, we can take our pacifism discussion and kind of invert some of the strengths and weaknesses as we talk here about the strengths and weaknesses of the just war tradition. I think that the point that John Howard Yoder makes in his book, When War is Unjust, should be food for thought for those on the just war side of things. There are fewer instances in history that we can point to of just war principles leading people not to fight or restraining the way they fight. I mean, I don't totally buy his argument, but I think there's something there that those who are on the just war side of the discussion need to pay attention to. I mean, maybe the restraint that we talk so much about in just war reasoning isn't quite as powerful as we would like to believe.
Right. It also seems to me is that the government, along with the use of the media, are experts. It's their job to figure out how to manipulate the greater public, as well as the church being part of the nation, to believe that every war that they deem worthy of fighting is a just war. And they spend a lot of time on that, often before actually launching an attack, say, on Iraq. And and how do you really know? How do you really have the necessary intelligence to determine whether a war is just? Because if it rests on the sovereign, well, the sovereign's got a very different agenda than the church with our mission of preaching the gospel and living like Christ. So it seems to me the sovereign can do whatever he wants, but ultimately it's the church that needs to decide if this war is just before we send our 18-year-olds off to another country.
That's a good point. I mean, first of all, in the government, I think there's an interesting tension there, because we can come up with so many examples of governments using propaganda messages in order to convey this message to the public or to the world that something is justified, that something is necessary, when in fact it was a decision to use military force, for other reasons, because it was easier, because it, whatever the case might be. But at the same time, those in certain positions in government do have access to information about things that are going on in the world that us normal civilians don't have. So, I think that's one of the reasons why the tradition says, well, it's the sovereign that has to make the decision, because it's the sovereign's responsibility to protect the public good, and the sovereign is likely to have a fuller picture of things.
They have access to the knowledge. On the other hand, they're notoriously dishonest.
Yeah, so I think if you found yourself in a government, and some people might think this is true about the United States, but if you find yourself in a government that you can't trust, I think it would be really hard to say, well, I'm going to be a soldier, because you may be commanded to go fight for a cause that is proclaimed as just, but may not in fact be. So, I think that's one of the, with the breakdown of trust in government and even trust in sort of the social fabric, that becomes a really hard problem for the whole question of fighting justly. But, back to your question about 18-year-olds in the church, there's conscientious objection. Most Western governments, at least the United States government, only have policies in place for what we could call a sort of broad, pacifist, comprehensive, or a conscientious objection to military service.
Right.
Like,
let's say based on the individual war.
Yeah, it has to be, you're against war in general. If that's the case and there's a draft, then the United States government would give me alternative service, as opposed to forcing me to fight or throwing me into prison for not fighting. But most church traditions that are on the just war side of things will also say that if you want us to be serious about this, you need to give us the possibility of selective conscientious objection. We need to be able to say, this conflict doesn't quite pass the bar of justice, so we're not going to send our 18-year-olds to fight. Because, and then along with that would be the possibility of saying, this does pass the bar. So we think this is clearly justified, so we are willing to sort of promote fighting in our 18-year-olds. And I have a 19-year-old kid, so this whole thing about sending 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds to fight also sends a chill through me. So we're speaking in more of a theoretical vein here, but we should also recognize that we're talking about some very serious stuff that shapes people's lives, that even when they're fighting rightly can also have such a traumatic effect on people's lives. So, there's discernment involved, and the church, as you're suggesting in your question, needs to play a role in guiding its members to think clearly and Christianly about whether using second order violence is the right thing to do in particular circumstances, while also discipling people so that if they end up fighting, they have been trained in such a way that they will be able to show that restraint and even that love for enemy in the way that they fight.
Right, because it seems to me in the peace church tradition, we do not support this. We encourage you to be a conscientious objector. We can't bless you going off to war. And in the just war tradition, well, you've been drafted or you volunteered, you're being called here. Well, we bless you, we pray for you, but there doesn't really seem to be structures set up for how do we discern this together? Is it just a local congregation? Is it denominational? Are there networks of churches? Who are the experts we bring in to discern this? How do we work with the families? How do we counsel the 18-year-olds? It seems like it's like, that's too messy. That's too difficult. We'll just pray for you and bless you.
Yeah, I think you're right that doing that in a more serious way requires more in-depth engagement in the question and more proactive engagement in the questions about what's going on in the world what's our responsibility as, citizens of the city of God and also citizens of this world. That's not one of those things that you can just decide, oh, you're going to do it right when a new conflict arises. It requires that proactive engagement, discipleship, conversation within communities, but also across communities. So I think that's a big challenge. And you're working in a church. I hope that that's the sort of thing that you can try to do in your community.
So in your last chapter, you talk about restraining the necessities of realism. So can you say more about that?
Yeah, so realism is a broad category, a way of talking about how the reality of the world, including the reality of aggression in the world, may sometimes require us to do things that we would rather not do, to use violence to stop further harm from happening. One of the terms that sometimes is used in that tradition, including in the just war expressions of it, is necessity. We should only fight when that's necessary. But when there is serious aggression up and running in the world, it is necessary to fight. There I've used the word necessity in a couple of different ways in adjacent sentences so we can start to see the slipperiness of it. Another trend related to that is that sometimes necessity is used to baptize, as it were, breaking the rules of just fighting. Well, we have to win, and the only way for us to win is to start slaughtering civilians, so it's necessary for us to do that. You can kind of take refuge in necessity. I think that's philosophically problematic. It's definitely theologically problematic. So that's what I'm trying to get at with that language of restraining the necessities of realism. We have to realize that most of the time it is possible for war to be waged in ways that protect civilians. And maybe it's not my place to say this, but it's possible to wage war in a way that doesn't dehumanize the enemy. So we need to avoid letting this language of necessity just help us creep further and further and further into the cycle of deepening violence and aggression.
Right. As a believer, there's only one thing that is necessary, and that is to follow Christ. And that may get us killed. That may get our family killed. Who knows? It's always to follow Christ. So it's so easy to say, well, I have to eat. It's necessary that I eat. It's necessary that I have shelter. It's necessary that I defend myself and my family. Well, if it's in keeping with Christ's will. So, yeah, that's necessity. It's one of those things where it's just assumed, well, we know what's necessary, but in Christ, everything is changed. So back to the criteria of martyrdom. Again, in your last chapter, you're dealing with the criteria of martyrdom, how it relates to just war. And you also finish up with a section on the theology of sainthood. So you're tying all things together here in the last chapter. What are you getting at?
I'm writing this book as a Protestant. Although anytime we talk about saints and martyrs, there's a lot of dialogue going on with especially Catholic traditions, since I'm in the West. But as a Protestant, the notion of sainthood and even the notion of martyrdom is not something that I think should be restricted to the very, very few hero Christians. The Apostles' Creed talks about the communion of the saints. We are all called to be sanctified in Christ. We are all Christians are called to be saints. And if living the life of holiness, that is sainthood, takes us into conflict with the powers of the world, that life of sanctification could take the form of martyrdom. But with all of that, I think when the Christian church names particular people as saints or martyrs, what we're doing is pointing to those folks as good examples of the way the Christian life ought to be led or lived. Not to say, hey, look at those superheroes that are so far away from anything that I could do. If we're actually pointing at them, what we're saying is that's an exemplary way of living the Christian life that I am called to take very seriously, that I am called to consider emulating in my own life. It's a call to those of us living Christians. It's a call to greater faithfulness. And so in relationship to military service, if it's possible that soldiers can be martyrs because they find a way to fight with Christ-inspired restraint, they find a way to fight that expresses love of the enemy, and I actually think that sometimes that makes you more vulnerable on the battlefield, then that points back in our direction. If we're pointing to particular people, including soldiers, as potential Christian martyrs, that's a way of saying we see the life of Christ lived there, truly and faithfully. We ought to go and do likewise. Now, that would mean we would have to go and fight, but it means that something in the example there has a call upon us. In a way, that's the sixth criteria of martyrdom that I discuss in the book, that if we're calling someone's story the story of martyrdom, that's because we are invited to live into that way of being a Christian in our own lives. And so I think with this possibility of calling Christian soldiers martyrs under certain circumstances, not all circumstances, but certain circumstances, because we see something about the life of Christ there, that's a reminder to us in the face of our own lives where we're tempted with various forms of coercion and violence. I mean, that's kind of the ultimate point of the book, is to suggest that what we see in an extreme situation in martyrdom can have a bearing on our own ordinary lives.
All right. And finally, how would you sum up the message to the church? Say you're asked to give a sermon at a particular church, and what would the core be there?
Well, the core message, I think, would be to just think about the examples that we set in front of us. We might call them saints, we might call them martyrs, we might call them something else. But the role of examples in the Christian church is that they're supposed to shed light on the living out of the life of discipleship for us. So, this might speak to your question. I mean, you're a pacifist, so you probably wouldn't take this approach in your own ministry. But let's say someone is pastoring a church that's part of a just war tradition. Then I think pointing to certain examples from time to time of soldiers who, yes, fought, but in a way that they really strive to do, consistent with the call of Christ. Those should be set before us, not for us to just kind of gaze at them, to be so impressed at them. So I'm kind of repeating myself here, but in a way that nudges us towards greater faithfulness. That's, I think, why the Christian church has honored the martyrs from the very beginning, because they're a window into something that we need to see. That can also be the case for us today.
All right. Well, I'm Dennis Metzler. You've been listening to The Charge. We've been with Dr. Matthew Lundberg. He's the author of the book, Christian Martyrdom and Christian Violence on Suffering and Wielding the Sword. There's a link below. Check that out. So, Dr. Lundberg, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, this was fun. Thanks for having me.
All right.